Technology has made things much easier than in the 70s, but in the process, specific incredible skills have been lost. Let's find out some life skills in the 70s that have vanished today. Number 1 on the list, paper maps. Today, if you want to go from your place to somewhere you've never been before, you have Google Maps for that. It was totally different in the 70s though. People relied solely on paper maps. Every kid that was 11 and above could use paper maps to navigate his or her way. Back then, paper maps were usually gotten from stations for free, but sometimes they were only available in a minimal amount. A paper map would typically show an aerial view of a city, a state, or a whole country in itself, but it also showed the network of roads and important landmarks. And yes, there's one more thing, unlike your GPS, which you can access at any time on your phone, which is that it is not advisable to open your maps when it is windy. Also, there was a unique way of folding maps, and that was a skill in itself that kids nowadays don't know about. Next is cursive handwriting. Another skill that was peculiar to the 70s was the use of cursive handwriting. In fact, this was a very dominant thing to the point that cursive handwriting was actually something that was taught by teachers to kids. It wasn't just a fancy thing people liked to do on a whim. It was a mandatory course taught by teachers and learned by kids. This wouldn't surprise you if you've come across your parents' or grandparents' letters. You'd especially notice they always ended their letter with the final "thank you" written in cursive. And even because they've taken cursive since elementary school, most people's handwriting always had some sort of slant to it. If you didn't notice this in your parents' letters, you might want to check again. However, cursive handwriting died down as typewriters became more dominant towards the latter of the 70s through to the 80s. And this brings us to the next 70s life skill, typewriter usage. You may have seen a typewriter before. Perhaps you've even hammered out your girlfriend's name on the keys to get it to appear on the paper. But that's not enough to think you know how to use a typewriter well. For instance, every kid in the 70s could do more than type on a typewriter. They also knew how to format a page properly. They could set the stops to halt the movement of the carriage past a particular point and also set the ribbon. Those who had a high-end typewriter could also clear the tabs. So answer honestly, can you do any of these? Clearly not, but you don't need to anyway. You have your phone or laptop nowadays. And all that mechanical process is pretty far gone, thanks to the advancement of technology. Regardless, if you were to use a typewriter today, you'd be forced to learn a thing or two and also practice over time before you get the hang of it. Unlike your laptop, which is relatively easy to operate. Even though people could use typewriters well, they preferred to write letters by hand. And this brings us to our next point. Letter writing was very common in the 70s. You could write to a friend, your boss at work, your relative, or even your enemy if you had one. Unlike nowadays when you can easily send messages to someone at the tap of a few buttons on your phone, that luxury wasn't afforded in the 70s. Interestingly, writing letters made people more mindful of their handwriting. They made sure they wrote in a clear and legible way so that what they were trying to pass across would be easily understood. But most of the letters were also written in cursive. After writing the letter, typically, it would be put in an envelope that was sealed with fancy stationery or even wax. Next is rotary phones. Rotary phones were a 70s thing, and if you're a kid watching this video, you've probably only seen this in old movies. But people in the 70s actually lived the experience of calling someone through a rotary phone and also receiving calls themselves. Usually, a rotary phone takes a long time to connect you to the person you're trying to call. And if you were angry at someone, by the time the recipient got your call, the anger was probably gone. That was how long it took. However, one remarkable feature of rotary phones is the very long, curly wires. The wires or cords, if you will, were so long you could lay on the floor and rotate whichever way while speaking to the person on the other end. And if you were pissed off by the other guy on the line, you could slam the receiver back into the rotary phone on the wall. It's a very satisfying feeling only 70s people can relate to. Next is the use of microwaves. You have a leftover meal at home and you're hungry again. What do? Of course, a Gen Z or millennial only knows one way, and that is a microwave. But back in the 70s, things weren't like this. Most people didn't have microwaves. So what did they do? The answer is actually surprisingly simple. They reheated leftover meals using the stove. But sometimes they also used their ovens, although the downside to using an oven was that the entire apartment would be heated up, which, to be fair, might not be a downside, but a blessing in disguise, especially during winter seasons. The best prescription for a reheat would be the combination of stove plus cast iron plus lid. Then you're good to go. Number 7 on the list is reading analog clocks. Kids in the 70s were taught how to read analog clocks. These clocks typically indicated not only the hour or the minute, they were also able to tell the exact second at a particular point in time. Such a level of precision required some sort of learning. All the clocks used at home as well as in classrooms were analog clocks, so kids had no way to avoid understanding them. It was a necessity. This is very unlike today, when one can immediately tell the time with the help of an app. Analog clocks still exist today, but they're not as common and widely used as they were in the 70s. So the skill of figuring out analog clocks is pretty much lost and has vanished. Number 8. Film photographs. Nowadays, we have the luxury of smartphones, but in the 70s, the only way people could capture the moment was through the use of film cameras. The process was a little methodical. First, you need to put a roll of film into the camera, and they need to be placed in a precise way, or else the picture won't come out well. Then, unlike now, when you can take a picture and see it almost instantly, you need to take the film to a photo lab where it would be developed in a dark room using chemicals. Then you had to wait for a moment. The wait was part of the magic, because when the picture finally came out, it was something really special. Photography then required patience, and the reward was always worth it. The same can be said for sewing and mending. Back in the 70s, kids were taught how to sew and mend wear and tear and whatever issues they might have with their clothes. A pair of pants with a terrible zip or a shirt with a lost button are examples of these things. A kid back then could pick a thread and needle to work wonders on fabric. But this wasn't too surprising, as kids were taught these things by their parents and grandparents, as well as by teachers, especially home economics teachers. This is not so today. People often discarded clothes with any slight wear or tear. Or if they are not willing to let go of the clothes, they pay a considerable amount to tailors to fix things a kid in the 70s would have done effortlessly. So, sewing and mending are sort of a lost art now, just like the use of cash. Kids in the 70s knew how to use cash for anything they wanted. They were able to conduct transactions in the stores and also count their change until they deemed it accurate. Most of the money they handled was pocket money given to them by their parents. Kids then had no apps to track their spending, so they had to remember how much they had left. And if they needed to save, say for a bicycle, they were very good at keeping it in piggy banks or jars. This taught them patience and the value of money. Cash transactions massively improved their math skills. All the digital computation handled today by swiping your credit card, kids back then used only their brains. 70s kids could handle cash as efficiently as they could use public transportation. In the 70s, kids were able to use public transportation on their own. They memorized bus routes and often navigated where they were going with paper maps, which we touched on earlier, on their own. Parents trusted their kids to do this effectively and without issues. They knew their boy or girl could go to school or a friend's house by taking the bus or train. The kids carried exact change for fares, and they knew how to transfer between routes. And remember, they had no phones to reach their parents for help. So if a bus was late or a stop was missed, they pretty much figured things out by themselves, without any adult supervision. This skill was essential for their confidence and problem-solving abilities. Today, parents often transport their kids by themselves, and not many kids handle their transportation as independently as it occurred in the 70s. Next on the list is reading encyclopedia. Kids in the 70s didn't have the luxury of the internet, so whenever they needed information, there was only one place they could go: encyclopedias. Encyclopedias are typically very thick, big books that contain information about so many topics from history to science to art, and so on. So when kids were given homework, encyclopedias were the only hope. It was how they figured things out in the absence of Google. They would have to carefully search for what they needed. Then, they'd take down notes critically about what they had learned. Because of the reliance on encyclopedias for information, kids have to go to the library more than kids nowadays do. And sometimes they even used multiple encyclopedias before they could come up with comprehensive answers. The whole process required patience because it was a methodical search. However, it also encouraged a deeper understanding of things because kids had to piece information together instead of copy-pasting an AI-generated response, for instance. The skill of digging deep and absorbing information is on the decline nowadays. Lastly, for this video, another life skill in the 70s that has vanished today is building and fixing simple devices. Kids were so equipped with mechanical knowledge. They could also fix broken radios and toasters and build toy planes and cars. The way they tinkered with these objects wasn't just an activity for amusing themselves. It was also a problem-solving skill that not only required patience and creative genius, but also improved. Some of them could rewire lamps, and others could fix bicycle chains without asking an adult to help out. Yes, 70s kids could do all that. They were that talented. All of these are some of the life skills that kids and adults in the 70s used to get by at the time. Which of these hold your fascination the most? Let us know in the comments.